The morning sun was just starting to peek over the mountains when Jake Morrison stepped out onto his front porch. The wooden boards creaked under his boots, a sound that used to comfort him but now just reminded him of everything falling apart. He was 52 years old, but the last few years had aged him 20 more. His weathered hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee as he stared out at what used to be his pride and joy. The land stretched out before him, brown and cracked like an old leather wallet left in the sun too long. Where green pastures once fed hundreds of cattle, now only dust and dead grass remained. The drought had been going on for 3 years now, and it had sucked the life out of everything he'd worked for. His cattle were mostly gone, sold off one by one just to keep the lights on. The few that remained were skinny and weak, barely surviving on the little hay he could afford to buy. Jake took a sip of his coffee and winced. It was bitter, just like everything else in his life these days. He could hear his 14-year-old son Tommy moving around inside the house, probably getting ready for another day of pretending everything was okay. But nothing was okay, and they both knew it. 2 years ago, Jake's wife Linda had lost her battle with cancer. The medical bills from her treatment had eaten through their savings like a wildfire through dry grass. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. Jake had watched helplessly as the woman he loved slipped away and then watched their bank account disappear right after her. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent everything trying to save her life, only to be left broke and alone. The sound of Tommy's footsteps coming down the stairs brought Jake back to the present. His son appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over his shoulder, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Tommy used to be such a happy kid, always laughing and joking around. He'd been good at school too, getting mostly A's, and talking about maybe becoming a veterinarian someday. But that was before his mom got sick, before the ranch started failing, before their whole world turned upside down. "Morning, Dad," Tommy mumbled, not really looking at him. "Morning, son." "You eat anything yet?" Tommy shrugged. "Not hungry." That was Tommy's answer to most questions these days. Not hungry, not tired, not interested. Jake knew his son was hurting, probably more than he let on. Losing your mom at 14 was hard enough, but watching your dad struggle to keep it together made it even worse. The school bus honked outside, and Tommy headed for the door without another word. Jake wanted to say something, anything that might make his son feel better, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? That everything would be all right? They both knew that was a lie. After Tommy left, Jake went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. Spread out in front of him were bills, notices, and official-looking letters that all said the same thing in different ways: pay up or get out. The bank had been patient for a while, understanding about Linda's medical situation and the drought. But patience only lasted so long, and theirs had run out. The foreclosure notice was dated 3 weeks ago. He had 30 days to come up with the money he owed or lose the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had started this place with nothing but determination and a dream. His father had built it up into something special, and now Jake was going to be the one to lose it all. He'd tried everything he could think of. Applied for loans that got rejected because he had no collateral left. Looked into selling parts of the land, but nobody wanted to buy drought-stricken property in the middle of nowhere. He'd even swallowed his pride and asked his brother in Phoenix for help, but his brother had his own family to worry about and couldn't spare that kind of money. The worst part wasn't losing the ranch, though that broke his heart. The worst part was knowing he was failing Tommy. His son had already lost his mother, and now he was going to lose his home too. Jake had seen the way other kids at school looked at Tommy sometimes, with that mixture of pity and awkwardness that people get around tragedy. Tommy pretended not to notice, but Jake knew better. As the day wore on, Jake tried to keep himself busy with the few chores that still mattered. He fed the remaining cattle, checked the water levels in the tanks, and fixed a broken gate that had been hanging crooked for weeks. But no matter what he did, his mind kept coming back to the same dark thoughts that had been haunting him for months. What kind of life was he giving Tommy? They were about to be homeless, broke, and starting over with nothing. Jake was 52 years old with no real skills outside of ranching. Who was going to hire a middle-aged cowboy with a high school education? And even if he found work, what kind of work would it be? Minimum wage jobs that would barely pay for a tiny apartment in some town where Tommy didn't know anybody? By the time Tommy got home from school, Jake had worked himself into a state of quiet desperation. His son dumped his backpack by the door and headed straight for his room without saying hello. That was normal now, but it still stung. "Tommy." "Wait," Jake called out. "Come sit with me for a minute." Tommy stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his shoulders sagging like he was carrying the weight of the world. "What's up, Dad? Just wanted to talk. How was school?" "Same as always." Tommy's voice was flat, emotionless. "Can I go do homework now?" Jake looked at his son and saw himself at that age, stubborn, proud, and trying so hard to be tough that he was missing out on being a kid. But there was something else there too. Something that scared Jake more than the foreclosure notices or the empty bank account. Tommy looked defeated, like he'd already given up on life before it really got started. "Actually," Jake said, an idea, forming in his mind that he knew was crazy but somehow felt right. "How about we skip homework tonight? I was thinking we could go camping, just you and me like we used to do with your mom." For the first time in weeks, Tommy showed a flicker of interest. "Camping? Where?" "Remember that canyon we found last year when we were hunting? The one with the rock formations that look like animals?" Tommy nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember. That place was pretty cool. What do you say? We could leave early tomorrow morning, spend a couple days out there. Just us guys, no bills, no problems, like the old days." Jake watched his son's face, hoping to see some of the enthusiasm that used to light up Tommy's eyes when they talked about adventures. Instead, Tommy just shrugged. "I guess that would be okay. But Dad, what about the cattle? And don't we have that meeting with the bank next week?" Jake felt his heart breaking a little more. 14 years old and already worrying about bank meetings and cattle? No kid should have to carry that kind of burden. "Don't you worry about any of that stuff?" Jake said, forcing a smile. That's my job. Your job is just to be a kid and have some fun. So what do you say? Want to go on one last adventure with your old man?" Tommy looked at him for a long moment, and Jake could see his son trying to decide whether to trust this sudden change. "In mood." Finally, Tommy nodded. Double quote. "Yeah, Dad, that sounds good." That night, after Tommy went to bed, Jake sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter. His hands shook as he tried to find the right words to explain what he couldn't say out loud. He folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope with Tommy's name on it, then placed it on the counter where someone would eventually find it. He packed light for their trip, just enough water for a day or two, some basic camping gear, and the old hunting rifle that had belonged to his father. As he loaded everything into his pickup truck, Jake tried not to think about what he was really planning. Instead, he focused on the idea that soon all the pain and worry and failure would be over, for both of them. The next morning came too soon for Jake, but not soon enough either. He barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and second-guessing himself. But when the sun started creeping through his bedroom window, he knew there was no turning back now. He'd made his choice. Tommy was already up when Jake came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal. The kid looked more awake than he had in months, and for a moment Jake felt his resolve waver. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe they should just face whatever came next together. "You ready for our adventure, Dad?" Tommy asked, and there was something in his voice that Jake hadn't heard in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or just excitement about getting away from all the problems at home. "Yeah, son, I'm ready." They loaded up the old pickup truck with their camping gear. Jake made sure to pack extra water bottles, though he knew they wouldn't need them for long. The morning air was already getting warm, and the weather forecast called for temperatures over 100 degrees. Perfect weather for what he had planned. As they drove away from the ranch, Jake caught Tommy looking back at their house in the side mirror. The place looked smaller from the distance, more rundown than Jake remembered. Paint peeling off the porch, fence posts leaning at odd angles, weeds growing where Linda's flower garden used to bloom. It wasn't much to look at anymore, but it was still home, or had been anyway. "Dad, Are we really going to lose the ranch? Tommy asked quietly. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd been hoping to avoid this conversation, at least for now. Don't worry about that stuff, Tommy. Today's just about us having some father-son time. But the bank notice said, we had to pay by next Friday. That's only 6 days away. Sometimes Jake forgot how smart his son was. Tommy might act like he didn't care about anything anymore, but he was still paying attention. Still worrying about things no 14-year-old should have to think about. I said don't worry about it, Jake repeated, maybe a little too sharply. He saw Tommy flinch and immediately felt bad. Look, son, I'm handling all that grown-up stuff. Your job is just to be a kid, okay? Tommy nodded but didn't look convinced. They drove in silence for a while, watching the landscape change from dried-up farmland to proper desert. Cactus and scrub brush replaced the dead grass and the mountains. In the distance, shimmered in the heat like a mirage. The drive took longer than Jake remembered. They passed through a few small towns, each one looking more desperate than the last. Boarded-up shops, empty gas stations, houses with broken windows and yards full of weeds. The drought hadn't just hurt ranchers like Jake, it had killed whole communities. After about 3 hours of driving, Jake turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that wasn't much more than 2 tire tracks in the sand. The pickup bounced and rattled over rocks and through shallow washes, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. I forgot how bumpy this road was, Tommy said, holding onto the door handle as they hit another pothole. Good thing we brought extra water, Jake replied. Though the words tasted bitter in his mouth, the dirt road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the desert. They'd passed a few other vehicles, mostly border patrol trucks and the occasional park ranger. But for the most part, they were completely alone. Just the way Jake wanted it. About 20 miles from the last paved road, Jake felt the truck start to pull to the right. At first he thought it was just the rough terrain, but then he heard the telltale flapping sound of a flat tire. Come on, he muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. Tommy got out to look at the damage, while Jake popped the hood and pretended to check the engine. The tire was definitely flat, but that wasn't the real problem. Jake had loosened a few bolts in the engine the night before, just enough to make sure the truck wouldn't be running for much longer. Can you fix it, Dad? Tommy asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Jake made a show of poking around under the hood, then shook his head. Looks like the radiator's overheating, and we've got that flat tire too. I think we're going to have to walk from here. Walk? How far is it to the canyon? Jake squinted at the sun, which was already brutal, even though it wasn't even noon yet. Maybe 5 or 6 miles, not too bad. What he didn't tell Tommy was that the canyon was actually more like 10 miles away, and that by the time they got there they'd be too exhausted and dehydrated to walk back. But Tommy didn't need to know that, not yet. They gathered up their supplies, a couple of water bottles, each some snacks and the basic camping gear. Jake left most of their water in the truck, telling Tommy they'd come back for it later. Another lie, but what was one more at this point? The desert heat hit them like a physical force as soon as they started walking. Within minutes, both of them were sweating heavily. Tommy pulled his baseball cap down low over his eyes and trudged along beside his father, not complaining but clearly struggling with the temperature. Tell me again why we couldn't camp somewhere closer to home, Tommy asked after they'd been walking for about an hour. Because this place is special, Jake said. Remember how peaceful it was last time we were there? Just us and the desert, no noise, no people, no problems. That much was true, at least. The canyon they were heading to was one of the most remote places Jake knew. He discovered it years ago while hunting, long before Tommy was born. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, with red rock walls and hidden pools that stayed cool, even in the summer heat. Linda had loved it there too, back when she was healthy, and they used to take family camping trips. As they walked deeper into the desert, Jake started to feel a strange sense of peace settling over him. The decision was made now. There was no going back, no changing his mind, no more lying awake at night worrying about money and failure and disappointing the people he loved. In a few hours it would all be over. Dad, I'm getting pretty thirsty, Tommy said, stopping to take a drink. From his water bottle, Jake checked his watch. They'd been walking for 2 hours, and the sun was getting higher and hotter by the minute. Tommy had already finished half his water, which wasn't good. They needed to pace themselves better. Let's find some shade and rest for a while, Jake suggested, pointing to a cluster of rocks up ahead. They settled down in the shadow of a large boulder, both of them breathing hard from the heat and exertion. Tommy leaned back against the rock and closed his eyes, looking younger than his 14 years. This is harder than I remembered, Tommy admitted. Yeah, the desert's no joke. But we're tough, right? Morrison men don't give up easy. Tommy smiled. At that, the first real smile Jake had seen from his son in weeks. It broke Jake's heart all over again. Dad, can I ask you something? Sure, son, anything. Do you ever think about Mom when we're out here? Jake felt his throat tighten. Every day, Tommy, every single day. I miss her so much sometimes I can't breathe, Tommy said quietly. And I know you miss her too. I see how sad you get when you think nobody's watching. Jake didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded and put his arm around his son's shoulders. But you know what? Tommy continued. I think she'd want us to keep going, even when things get really hard. She was always telling us to never give up, remember? Yeah, Jake whispered. I remember. They sat in the shade for another 20 minutes, sharing small sips of water and watching lizards dart between the rocks. Then Jake stood up and shouldered his pack. Ready to keep going? Tommy nodded and got to his feet. As they resumed their walk deeper into the desert, Jake tried to push away the doubts that his son's words had planted in his mind. It was too late for second thoughts now. They were already too far from the truck to turn back safely, and the temperature was still climbing. The canyon was still hours away, and with each step, Jake felt like he was walking toward the end of everything. By the time they reached the canyon, both Jake and Tommy were stumbling with exhaustion. The sun was at its highest point now, turning the desert into a furnace that seemed to suck the life out of everything it touched. Tommy's face was red and puffy from the heat, and he'd finished his water an hour ago. Jake had given his son most of his own water, leaving himself with just a few sips in the bottom of his bottle. The canyon walls rose up around them like the ribs of some ancient giant, offering blessed shade for the first time in hours. Tommy collapsed against a rock wall and slid down to sit in the sand, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Dad, I don't feel so good, Tommy said, his voice weak and raspy. Jake knelt down beside his son and felt his forehead. Tommy's skin was burning hot but bone dry, no sweat left in him. Classic signs of heat exhaustion, maybe even heat stroke. Jake's plan was working exactly as he'd intended, but seeing his son suffer made him question everything all over again. Just rest for a minute, Jake said, pouring the last of his water into Tommy's mouth. You'll feel better in the shade. But Jake knew better. They were both dangerously dehydrated, miles from help, with no way to call for rescue even if they wanted. Teal. The canyon was beautiful, with its red rock walls and hidden pools, but it would also be their tomb as the afternoon wore on. Tommy seemed to get a little better in the cool shade of the canyon. They found a small overhang that protected them from the sun, and Jake tried to make his son as comfortable as possible. Tommy dozed fitfully, mumbling in his sleep about his mother and asking for water that Jake didn't have to give him. Jake sat watching his son sleep and wondered if he was doing the right thing. The rational part of his mind said yes, they had. No future, no money, no hope. Tommy would be better off not having to live through the shame of losing their home and starting over with nothing. But another part of him, the part that sounded like Linda's voice, kept asking if this was really what she would have wanted. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple, Tommy woke up. He looked around with confused eyes as if he couldn't remember where they were or how they'd gotten there. Dad, where are we? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. We're at the canyon, son. Remember our camping trip? Tommy nodded slowly, but Jake could see that his son was starting to realize this wasn't a normal camping trip. They had no tent, no food, no water. Just the two of them sitting in the desert waiting to die. "Dad, I'm scared," Tommy admitted. And hearing those words nearly broke Jake's resolve completely. "I know, son, but we're together. That's what matters." Jake pulled Tommy close to him, feeling how small and fragile his son seemed. Just a kid who'd already lost too much and didn't deserve to lose anything more. They sat there as darkness fell over the canyon, both of them too weak and dehydrated to talk much. That's when they heard it. At first, Jake thought he was hallucinating. The sound was so faint and so out of place that it couldn't be real. But Tommy heard it too, lifting his head and looking around with sudden alertness. "Dad, did you hear that?" The sound came again, carried on the evening breeze that had started to cool the desert air. It was unmistakable now, the cry of a baby, thin and desperate and heartbreaking. "There's no way," Jake muttered. But he was already struggling to his feet. The crying came again, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it hard to tell which direction it was coming from. Tommy was up now too, following the sound with an urgency that seemed to give him new strength. "Someone's out here," Tommy said. "Someone needs help." They moved through the canyon as quickly as their weakened bodies would allow, following the baby's cries like a lifeline. The sound led them deeper into the maze of rock walls and narrow passages, to places Jake had never explored before. "Over here?" Tommy called out, pointing to a dark opening in the canyon wall that looked like it might be a cave. The crying was definitely coming from inside. Jake pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, even though the battery was almost dead. The weak light revealed a small cavern, maybe 10 feet deep, with smooth walls carved by thousands of years of flash floods, and there, huddled in the back corner like a wounded animal, was a young woman holding a baby. Jake's first instinct was that he was seeing things. Heat stroke could cause hallucinations, and maybe his guilt over what he was putting. Tommy had conjured up this vision of someone who needed saving instead of someone giving up. But Tommy saw her too, rushing forward before Jake could. "Stop him, ma'am, are you okay?" Tommy called out, his voice cracking with emotion. The woman looked up at them with eyes that were too bright in her sunken face. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair that was matted with sweat and dust. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she looked like she hadn't had water in days. But she was clutching that baby like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Poor Favor," she whispered, her voice so hoarse Jake could barely understand her. "Ayuda mi bebé." Jake didn't speak much Spanish, but he knew enough to understand that she was begging them to help her baby. The infant in her arms was maybe 8 months old, a little girl with dark hair and the kind of chubby cheeks that should have been healthy and pink. Instead, the baby's skin looked gray and lifeless, and she was crying with a weak, pitiful sound that cut right through Jake's heart. "Tommy, give me your shirt," Jake said. Already pulling off his own, they used their shirts to create a makeshift shelter, blocking the baby from what was left of the sun's heat. The woman, Jake guessed her name might be Maria or Carmen or one of the other names he'd heard from the Latino families who used to work the ranches around here, tried to tell them something in rapid Spanish, but she was too weak and dehydrated to make much sense. "She's been walking," Tommy said, pointing to the woman's feet, which were bloody and swollen. "Look at her shoes." The woman's sneakers were falling apart, held together with duct tape and prayers. Her feet were a mess of blisters and cuts, and Jake could see dried blood on her socks where the shoes had rubbed raw spots. "How long have you been out here?" Jake asked, speaking slowly and clearly. The woman held up 3 fingers, then 4, then seemed to give up trying to communicate. But Jake understood. 3 days, maybe 4. Long enough to be close to death from dehydration, especially carrying a baby in this heat. Jake looked at Tommy and saw his own thoughts reflected in his son's eyes. They had come here to die, but now they had found someone who was fighting desperately to live, a mother who had walked through hell to try to give her baby a better life, only to end up trapped in this desert furnace with no hope of rescue. "Dad, we have to help them," Tommy said. And there was something in his voice that Jake hadn't heard in months. Purpose, determination, hope. Jake nodded, even though he knew they were all in trouble now. They had no water, no food, and no way to call for help. 4 people dying instead of 2? But somehow, finding this woman and her baby had changed everything. The despair that had been eating at Jake for months was still there, but it was mixed now with something else. The need to protect, to help, to be better than the man who had brought his son out here to die. "What's your name?" Jake asked the woman, kneeling down beside her. "Carmen," she whispered, confirming his guess. "Carmen Reyes, Isabella." Isabella? Even in her weakened state, the baby was beautiful. She had her mother's dark eyes and a little button nose that reminded Jake of Tommy when he was that age. Looking at her, Jake couldn't understand how he had ever thought that giving up was the right choice. "We're going to get you out of here," Jake told Carmen. Even though he had no idea how Carmen looked at him with eyes full of tears and gratitude, but also with the knowledge that they were all probably going to die in this canyon. She had been walking for days, maybe weeks, trying to reach safety. And now she had found 2 more lost souls instead of salvation. As the desert night settled around them, Jake held his son close and watched Carmen sing softly to her baby. The words were in Spanish, but Jake recognized a lullaby when he heard. One, a mother's last gift to her child, a song to carry her into whatever came next, but Jake wasn't ready to give up anymore. Not with Tommy depending on him, and certainly not with this young mother and her baby needing his help. He had come to the desert to end his story, but maybe instead he had found a chance to begin a new chapter. The desert night brought a blessed coolness that felt like a miracle after the scorching heat of the day. Jake sat in the small cave with his arm around Tommy, watching Carmen cradle her baby daughter Isabella. The little girl had stopped crying, which should have been a relief, but Jake knew enough about dehydration to understand that silence wasn't always a good thing. "Dad, she's not moving much," Tommy whispered, nodding toward the baby. Jake had noticed it too. Isabella's breathing was shallow and quick, like a small bird's. Her tiny lips were cracked and dry, and when Carmen tried to get her to drink a few drops of water from Jake's nearly empty bottle, the baby barely responded. "We need to get them help," Jake said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew how impossible that sounded. They were at least 10 miles from where they'd left the broken-down truck, and the truck itself was 20 miles from the nearest road. Even if Jake could somehow make that journey on foot, he'd never survive it in his current condition. Carmen seemed to understand some English, because she looked up at Jake with desperate eyes. "Mi bibi," she whispered. "Por favor, help me bibi." Jake knelt down beside her and gently touched Isabella's forehead. The baby's skin was hot and dry, burning with fever. Without water and medical attention soon, she wouldn't make it through the night. "Tell me what happened," Jake said to Carmen, speaking slowly and clearly. "How did you get here?" Carmen's English was limited, but between her broken words and gestures, Jake began to piece together her story. She had been walking for days, maybe a week, trying to cross the desert with a group of other people. They had a guide, someone who was supposed to know the safe routes and where to find water. But something had gone wrong. The guide had taken their money and abandoned them when Carmen couldn't keep up with the group because of the baby. "Coyote," Carmen said, spitting the word like a curse. "Bad man left us," Jake understood. Coyotes were human smugglers who charged desperate people thousands of dollars to guide them across the border. Some were decent people just trying to help families find a better life. Others were criminals who didn't care if their clients lived or died as long as they got paid first. "How long have you been walking alone?" Tommy asked. Carmen held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the baby. 3 days, no water, Isabella. She started crying, and Jake could see the guilt and fear in her eyes. A mother's worst nightmare, watching her child suffer and not being able to help. Jake looked around the cave, trying to think. They had maybe half a bottle of water left between all of them. Not nearly enough for 4 people, especially with a sick baby who needed constant hydration. His phone had died hours ago, so calling for help was out of the question. And even if he could call someone, it would take hours for rescue teams to find them in this maze of canyons. "Tommy," Jake said quietly, pulling his son aside, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "How are you feeling? Really feeling?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Tired, thirsty, but not as bad as before." The shade helped. I think Jake nodded. Tommy was young and strong, and the few hours of rest in the cool cave had helped him recover some of his strength. Jake himself felt like he'd been run over by a truck, but he was still functional. Carmen and Isabella, on the other hand, were in critical condition. "I'm going to hike back to the truck," Jake announced. "See if I can get the engine running, or at least find more water." "Dad, no," Tommy said immediately. "You'll never make it." "It's too far, and you're already dehydrated?" "I have to try, son. That baby is dying." Tommy looked over at Carmen, who was trying to get Isabella to take another drop of water. The baby's eyes were closed now, and she wasn't responding to her mother's gentle touches. "Then I'm coming with you," Tommy said. "Absolutely not. I need you to stay here and take care of them. If something happens to me, you're their only hope." Tommy wanted to argue. Jake could see it in his eyes. But his son was smart enough to understand the situation they were in. Someone had to stay with Carmen and Isabella, and someone had to try for help. They couldn't all go, and they couldn't all stay. "Dad," Tommy said, his voice shaking slightly, "what if you don't come back?" Jake put his hands on his son's shoulders and looked him straight in the eyes. "Then you keep these two alive until someone finds you. You're stronger than you know, Tommy. Your mom always said you had more courage than any of us." Jake could see Tommy trying not to cry. His son had already lost his mother, and now Jake was asking him to risk losing his father too. But there wasn't another choice. "How will anyone know where to look for us?" Tommy asked. Jake pulled a small notepad from his pocket and quickly sketched a rough map of the canyon, marking their location. "If I don't make it back by tomorrow night, you try to signal for help. Use the mirror from your camping kit to reflect sunlight during the day. At night, if you see any aircraft, use the flashlight. Someone will find you." He handed Tommy the last of their water and the few energy bars they had left. "Give Isabella tiny sips every few minutes, just enough to wet her lips, and keep Carmen talking. Don't let her give up." Tommy nodded, trying to look braver than Jake knew he felt. "Dad, I'm scared." "I know, son, I'm scared too. But sometimes being scared means you're about to do something really important." Jake hugged his son tightly, breathing in the smell of his hair and trying to memorize the feeling of holding him. When he let go, Tommy's eyes were wet with tears, but his jaw was set with determination. "Take care of them," Jake said. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Jake turned to Carmen, who had been watching their conversation with growing understanding. She might not speak much English, but she knew what was happening. "I go for help," Jake told her. "Tommy, stay. You take care of each other, okay?" Carmen nodded and reached out to squeeze Jake's hand. "Gracias," she whispered. "Dios bless you." Jake stepped out of the cave and into the cool desert night. The temperature had dropped at least 30 degrees since sunset, which was both a blessing and a problem. It would be easier to travel in the cooler air, but it also meant he'd be hiking in complete darkness over dangerous terrain. He had no flashlight. They'd given the only working one to Tommy, so he had to navigate by starlight and feel his way carefully over the rocky ground. Every step was a gamble. One wrong move, one loose rock or hidden hole, and he could break an ankle or worse. But Isabella's tiny face kept appearing in his mind, driving him forward. The first hour of hiking was the hardest. Jake's legs felt like rubber, and his head was pounding from dehydration. But as he walked, something strange began to happen. The despair that had been crushing him for months started to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Linda died. He wasn't walking toward death anymore. He was walking toward life, toward a chance to save an innocent baby and her mother, toward giving his son a reason to believe in heroes again, toward proving that Jake Morrison wasn't just a failure who gave up when things got tough. The stars above him seemed brighter than he remembered, and for the first time in years, Jake found himself praying. Not for forgiveness or for miracles, but for strength. Strength to keep walking when his body wanted to quit. Strength to find help before it was too late. Strength to be the father Tommy deserved and the man Linda had believed he could be. As he climbed out of the canyon and onto the desert floor, Jake could see lights in the distance, probably a border patrol station or a ranger outpost. Still miles away, but closer than he dared to hope. He picked up his pace, ignoring the pain in his legs and the fire in his lungs behind him. In a small cave in the middle of nowhere, his 14-year-old son was caring for a dying baby and her desperate mother. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it filled Jake with pride. Tommy was stronger than either of them had realized, and tonight he was going to prove it. Jake stumbled through the desert darkness for what felt like forever, following the distant lights that seemed to dance just out of reach. His legs shook with every step, and his mouth felt like it was full of sand, but he kept pushing forward. Every time he wanted to give up, he thought about Isabella's tiny face and Tommy's brave eyes as he'd promised to take care of. Carmen and her baby, the lights turned out to be farther away than they looked, a cruel trick of the desert that Jake should have remembered from his younger days. But finally, just as the first pale hints of dawn were creeping across the sky, he reached a small concrete building with a radio tower and a couple of government trucks parked outside. Jake pounded on the door with the last of his strength, making enough noise to wake the dead. A few minutes later, a sleepy-looking Border Patrol agent opened the door, took one look at Jake's sunburned, desperate face, and immediately called for backup. "Sir, are you okay?" "How did you get out here?" Jake could barely speak. His throat was so dry, but he managed to croak out the most important words. "Baby dying, canyon, need helicopter." The agent, whose name tag read Rodriguez, brought Jake inside and gave him water while he called for a search and rescue team. Jake tried to explain the situation between gulps of the most delicious water he'd ever tasted in his life. "There's a woman and her baby in Red Rock Canyon about 10 miles east of here. My son's with them. The baby's in bad shape, severe dehydration, maybe heat stroke. They need medical attention immediately." Rodriguez was already on the radio, coordinating with the local sheriff's department and medical helicopter services. Within 30 minutes, Jake could hear the distant sound of rotor blades cutting through the morning air. "Can you guide us back there?" Rodriguez asked. Jake nodded, even though he wasn't sure his legs would carry him another step. "My son's there. I have to go back." The helicopter ride over the desert was like seeing the world from God's perspective. The landscape that had nearly killed them looked almost peaceful from above, all red rocks and golden sand stretching to the horizon. Jake pressed his face to the window, scanning the maze of canyons below until he spotted the right formation. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow canyon with walls that looked like folded paper. "The cave is about halfway down on the north side." The pilot circled the area while the crew looked for a safe place to land. Jake's heart was pounding as they descended, afraid of what they might find. It had been almost 8 hours since he'd left Tommy with Carmen and Isabella. 8 hours was a long time for a sick baby and a dehydrated teenager. The helicopter touched down on a flat area near the canyon entrance, and Jake led the rescue team through the twisting passages to the small cave. His legs were shaking from exhaustion and fear, but he pushed forward, calling out Tommy's name. "Dad? Dad? Is that you?" Tommy's voice echoed off the canyon walls, and Jake nearly cried with relief. His son sounded weak but alert, which was more than Jake had dared to hope for. They found Tommy sitting in the cave's entrance, holding Isabella while Carmen dozed fitfully against the back wall. The baby was still alive, but she looked even worse than when Jake had left. Her skin had a grayish tint, and she was so still that for a moment Jake thought they were too late. "How is she?" Jake asked, kneeling beside his son. "She stopped crying about 2 hours ago," Tommy said quietly. "I've been giving her tiny drops of water like you said, but I don't think she's swallowing much. Carmen's been talking to her in Spanish, singing songs. I think she's trying to keep Isabella awake." The paramedics took over immediately, starting 4 lines and checking vital signs while Jake held Tommy close. His son had somehow managed to keep both Carmen and Isabella alive through the long desert night, and Jake had never been prouder of anyone in his life. "You did good, son," Jake whispered. "You saved their lives." The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of medical equipment and urgent voices. Carmen was conscious but severely dehydrated, while Isabella was in critical condition. The doctors worked on both of them during the flight, and Jake found himself praying harder than he had since Linda's last days in the hospital. At the medical center in Phoenix, Jake and Tommy waited in the emergency room while doctors treated Carmen and Isabella. Jake called his brother to let him know what had happened, and within a few hours, family members started showing up to offer support, but Jake's real focus was on the two people he'd found in the desert. Carmen was recovering well, 4 fluids, and rest were working their magic. Isabella's situation was more serious, but the doctors said her chances were good now that she was getting proper medical care. Mr. Morrison? A young doctor approached Jake in the waiting room. I'm Dr. Chun. I've been treating Isabella Reyes. Jake stood up quickly. How is she? She's going to be fine. Babies are remarkably resilient, and you got her here just in time. Another few hours, and we might have had a very different outcome. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. Tommy grabbed his arm to steady him, and they both started crying, not from sadness this time, but from pure joy over the next few days. As Carmen and Isabella recovered, Jake learned more about their story. Carmen had walked for over a week through the desert, carrying her baby and following a group of other migrants who were trying to reach family in the United States. She was fleeing violence in Guatemala, where gangs had threatened her and Isabella after Carmen refused to let them use her small shop as a drug storage location. I come for Isabella, Carmen explained to Jake in her improving English. For better life, safe life. Jake understood that feeling completely. The desperate need to protect your child, to give them a chance at something better, even if it meant risking everything you had. When Carmen was released from the hospital, she had nowhere to go. The immigration officials were being kind, but Carmen's legal status was uncertain, and she was facing possible deportation back to the very dangers she'd fled. That's when Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. She can stay with us, he told the social worker handling Carmen's case. At least until she gets back on her feet. Tommy looked at his father with wide eyes. Really, Dad? But what about the ranch? I thought we were going to lose it. Jake had been thinking about that too. The foreclosure notice was still sitting on his kitchen table, and the bank wasn't going to give him any more extensions. But something had changed during those hours in the desert. The despair that had been eating at him for months was gone, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. We'll figure it out, Jake said. We always do. And somehow they did. Jake's story made the local news, and people started reaching out to help. A lawyer offered to take Carmen's immigration case for free. A local church raised money to help with medical bills, and a rancher in the next county offered Jake a job managing his cattle operation, with housing included for Jake, Tommy, and their guests. 6 months later, Jake stood on the porch of their new home, watching Tommy teach Isabella how to pet the gentle horses in the nearby pasture. The little girl was healthy and happy now, babbling in both English and Spanish as she toddled around the yard. Carmen worked at a local restaurant and was taking English classes at night, slowly building a new life for herself and her daughter. The old ranch was gone, sold to pay off the debts, but Jake didn't miss it as much as he'd thought he would. This new place felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived since Linda died. Maybe because it represented hope instead of loss, new beginnings instead of endings. Dad, look, Tommy called out. Isabella took 3 steps by herself. Jake smiled and waved, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. He'd gone into the desert planning to end his story, but instead he discovered that sometimes the most beautiful chapters come after you think the book is finished. Carmen appeared beside him on the porch, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. Gracias, she said, as she did every day, for everything. Thank you, Jake replied, and he meant it. You saved us too. As the sun set over their new home, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake Morrison finally understood what Linda had been trying to tell him all along. Life wasn't about avoiding failure or preventing loss. It was about finding the courage to keep going, to help others when you could, and to believe that tomorrow might bring something beautiful, even When today felt impossible in the desert, he'd thought he was walking toward the end. Instead, he'd found a new beginning.